Okay, let's get into this. We've put together what might be the most chilling deep dive we've ever done. The amount of source material we've pulled from is, well, it's just overwhelming. And this isn't some survey of crime. It's an exhaustive first-person catalog of violence. The actual blueprints for murder and the human wreckage that's left behind.
It is. The sources here, well, they come from everywhere. We're talking mob hitmen, Harlem crack kingpins, Mexican sicarios, guys who just got out of max security, international drug traffickers. And with this sheer volume of detail, we have to look at this violence as something more than just chaotic brutality.
That's it exactly. Our mission here, it's very specific today. We have to analyze violence as a functional tool, a mechanism for deterrence, for enforcement, in places where the rule of law it isn't there. It's the core of how everything works.
Correct. In this world, violence is a market signal. It's transactional, it's currency, it's payment, and it's collateral, all at the same time. So if you really want to understand how these organizations tick, you have to treat force like an economic tool, not just some moral failing.
And while we do that clinical dissection, we just can't lose sight of the wreckage. That's what I want to focus on, the human reality, the trauma, the unbelievable near-death stories, and the specific incidents that you can't forget. We have to look past the numbers, to the bodies, to the scars you can't see, the cost that isn't about dollars.
Agreed. And to really get into this, we have to start at the bottom, the foundation. Why does this level of violence even exist in these markets? How is it used to make sure a deal is honored? We have to start with the business ledger.
It all starts the second you decide to sell something illegal. You give up your right to call the cops. You can't dial 911 when your shipment gets ripped off or when someone won't pay you back. You're on your own.
And that vulnerability, that's the original sin of the entire operation. It creates a vacuum where the courts and police should be. Violence rushes in. It becomes this unregulated, incredibly efficient, and brutally decisive enforcement arm.
And this vacuum, it lets these specialized predators just thrive. The perfect example is the taxman concept. We see it so clearly in the accounts from Stephen French. He wasn't just a drug dealer. His specialty was robbing other drug dealers.
Exactly. French understood the dilemma perfectly. If he robs a legal shop, he's got the police, the courts, the whole system after him. Yeah. But if he robs a big-time drug dealer, well, that dealer has a choice. He can either just eat the loss, stay quiet, or he can retaliate with his own violence, which, usually just brings more heat and more problems.
So the taxman operation, it wasn't really just robbery. It was like he was imposing this brutal, informal tax on the parts of the illegal economy that couldn't protect themselves.
It's a protection racket, essentially.
Yeah. It's the price you pay for being unprotected. If you're out there slinging drugs, but you don't have the muscle, the reputation, or just the raw willingness to use lethal force to protect your stuff, you're a mark. French saw that the violence he used was basically given a green light because his victims couldn't go to the law. It was a risk, sure, but a calculated one, and it paid off because the price of real protection was often way higher than the loss from one of his robberies.
We're basically talking about the privatization of force. And the transactional nature of it just scales up, dramatically when you get to the big international deals. At that level, violence isn't a reaction anymore. It's a proactive guarantee baked into the deal from the start.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics of that. The contract killing as an operational guarantee. The Cali cartel's process is a perfect example. When they were setting up these massive multi-million-dollar deals, with crews from different countries, they couldn't just shake hands on it. Trust wasn't enough.
No, not even close. The accounts we have detail how a huge deal might be set up in, say, Panama. And Panama was chosen specifically because it was seen as neutral ground. But as soon as the terms were agreed on, enforcement had to be put in place immediately. And this is where the guarantee man comes in, an established hitman. And you're right, he wasn't just security. He was the living, breathing, lethal insurance policy on the deal.
So in one of the scenarios we looked at, the deal is made in Panama, and the guarantee man is immediately sent to Honduras. And you have to ask, why Honduras?
Because that's where the buyers were based. That's where the highest risk of someone backing out or not paying was. His physical presence there was the guarantee. If that deal went south, if the local guys didn't send the money back to the capital in Colombia for the product that was already on its way, the solution wasn't a lawsuit. It was immediate lethal violence from the man they sent to watch over it. His job wasn't to help the deal along. It was to make sure it was honored through the threat of death or the act of it.
That's the transaction at scale. But it gets so much darker, so much more, pathological when the violence turns inward, when it's not about, enforcing a new deal, but about wiping out an old debt with someone on your own side. This is where you see the old mob rules just start to crumble.
Right. The traditional mafia codes, which people love to romanticize, they had strict rules about this stuff. Killing a made man, or even a close associate, just over money, that was seen as a huge breach. It was supposed to get you killed by the commission because it destabilized the whole system. It breaks the trust that everything is built on.
And yet, we have this account from a mafia associate who saw the rot setting firsthand. It was about a guy named Dominic. Dominic owed another man a lot of money, $250,000. And when the associate asked Dominic why that man ended up dead,
The answer he got back was just chilling. Dominic just said it was easier than giving him a $250,000 that I owed him. I mean, think about that. This isn't strategy. It's not enforcement. This is just raw, impulsive pathology pretending to be a business decision. The debt wasn't paid. It wasn't negotiated. It was just erased by erasing the person.
I find that moment so telling. The informant, the guy telling the story, he called that the dirtiest part of the whole game. Killing for convenience, for your own wallet. It was a clear break from the old ways, which, as twisted as they were, had rules. This shift to just pure self-serving violence. It's why a lot of the old-timers said the mob started losing their minds. They were eating themselves from the inside out.
And that kind of ruthlessness, it went all the way up to challenging the state itself. Which brings us to this incredible story about the transactional view law enforcement takes. This same mafia associate, he brought a tip to the FBI, a huge one. A conspiracy was in the works to assassinate a sitting federal judge and an assistant U.S. attorney.
I mean, this is a massive plot. It would have put Dominic away for life, and the informant literally saved the lives of 2 federal officials. A remarkable thing to do. You'd think, right, that this kind of cooperation would get him some serious goodwill. Protection. Anything.
You'd think. But the details in the source material, they really show you how the state can view organized crime with that same cold calculus. So he provides this life-saving intel. Then later he gets picked up on some minor charge, totally unrelated. And the FBI agent, Michael Gator, showed what was described as just total indifference.
Yeah, the account says Gator just gave him this blank look. They weren't grateful. They weren't interested in justice for the plot he stopped. They just wanted the next piece of leverage. And get this, once the informant was arrested, the FBI never even pursued the conspiracy to kill the judge and the prosecutor.
Never. It was just dropped. It was seen as irrelevant compared to their main goal, which was getting big, flashy convictions. The safety of their own people, once it was secured, was yesterday's news. The FBI's thinking was purely tactical. Those lies were a bargaining chip, and the only thing that mattered was what the informant could give them next.
That coldness from the state side, it just highlights how this transactional view of life runs through the entire system, criminal and government. Life is just leverage. And speaking of violence for financial gain, we have to touch on this other account. It's highly specific, deeply controversial. The one about the death of Kurt Cobain. We have to be really careful here, acknowledge this is a disputed narrative, but it's in the source material we've reviewed.
Absolutely. According to the sources that push this theory, the violence here was, again, purely financial. It was about securing future assets, specifically his royalties. And the key was staging the death to look like a suicide from a drug overdose, not a contract killing.
The whole theory really hinges on a few key forensic points. First, the amount of heroin in his system. According to experts cited in these sources, it was so high that he would have been completely incapacitated, if not dead, before he could have possibly picked up a shotgun, aimed it, and pulled the trigger. Now, the suicide theory uses that as proof of his depression, but the other side says it's proof he was incapacitated first.
Right. And those sources suggest a very specific method, that he was allegedly strangled first, making him unconscious or dead, and then the shotgun was used to stage the scene. The weapon was also reportedly wiped clean. No fingerprints, which is, a very strange detail for a suicide.
The sources allege involvement from people like Dylan Carlson and Mark Lanigan, suggesting it was all a calculated hit. A clinical execution designed to get financial control of his legacy, his future earnings. It's violence as well as asset recovery.
And what's so striking here, regardless of what you believe happened, is the motive being described. It's the same pattern. Whether it's a Cali cartel hitman in Honduras guaranteeing a drug deal, a mobster getting killed over a $250,000 debt, or a rock star's death being staged for royalties, it's all high-level violence. The motive is identical. Get rid of a person to secure the money. So now that we've looked at violence for specific contracts, specific debts, we need to shift. We need to look at violence for macro-level control. This is about taking, holding, and expanding territory. It's about setting the price of doing business in your area through pure, raw deterrence. This is the bloody price of admission for any criminal expansion.
And to really get the fundamental cost of entry, you just have to look at the early crack wars in Harlem. The accounts we have detailing Chongo's empire needing to grow, moving from their turf on 117th Street down to 107th. When they tried to set up shop and abandon buildings there, the guys already on the block just said, "Oh, you can't hustle here."
And in that situation, violence is the deed to the property. It's the non-negotiable upfront capital investment you have to make. One of the former kingpins gave this really visceral image of how they first took that block. He said they came down with a solo shotgun and just sat on it like it was a chair right on the corner of 107th.
That shotgun wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement, a declaration of sovereignty. It was a nonverbal way of saying, we are willing to escalate this to murder right now over this piece of sidewalk. It builds a reputation for violence, and then eventually the reputation itself becomes the weapon.
Exactly. And then you have to use it defensively, too, to protect what you've just taken.
Hmm.
We've got accounts from the Yellow Top crew talking about how a former kingpin, who was known as a gun boy, was brought in to fix a problem. The problem was a guy who got shot but didn't die, and everyone knew he was coming back for revenge.
That's the calculated risk. It wasn't about taking new ground, it was about eliminating a threat to the market they already controlled. If that guy comes back shooting, it destabilizes everything. It brings the cops, it makes you look weak. So violence becomes the necessary preemptive strike to protect the business. If you don't handle it, the whole thing could fall apart.
Now, if we switch over to the biker gangs, you see a similar territorial drive, but it's layered with this kind of outlaw self-governance. The Hells Angels, they see themselves as completely outside the law. They believe they can control territory in a way the local police either can't or won't.
That example from Ventura County is perfect. It shows this hyper-local, non-state government in action. Drive-by shootings were becoming a big problem in some neighborhoods. The police couldn't stop it. So the Hells Angels, whose own businesses need a certain kind of stability to operate, they stepped in.
They called a meeting, all of local street gangs, and they gave them a very clear, very brutal ultimatum. Stop the drive-by shootings. They're bad for the community. They're bad for our business. If you don't, we will intercede. And everyone knew what intercede meant. This is violence acting as a de facto police force, maintaining a very specific, violently enforced kind of order that serves their own needs.
And their control over territory isn't just about local order, it's about absolute protocol. If another gang crosses the line, the response is immediate. The Bandidos beef in Vegas is a great example. A rival gang got targeted, and the reason was simple. They didn't have a hall pass to ride through Hells Angels territory in Nevada.
It's like enforcing an undeclared border. The border is defined by your capacity to commit violence. If you don't respect the protocol, the hall pass, you are directly challenging their sovereignty. And that challenge has to be met with immediate, decisive violence to reset that equation of deterrence.
But when you really want to talk about weaponizing territory and deterrence, I mean, no one in modern history has reached the scale or the sheer depravity of the Mexican cartels, specifically the Zetas.
The Zetas are the textbook case. Maximum deterrence through narco-terrorism. Our sources consistently describe them as doing way too much violence. They're put in the same category as groups like ISIS or the Taliban. Their tactic for taking over new territory was explicitly scorched earth.
They didn't want allies. They wanted to crush all resistance, instantly and completely. It's actually, in a twisted way, very efficient. If your opposition is annihilated and the local population is paralyzed with fear, you don't need to waste time with politics or negotiations.
And the psychological warfare was absolutely central to their business model. It was their main communication strategy. They'd move into a new slum, they'd identify the punto de venta, the local dope spot, and instead of trying to negotiate a tax, they'd just use brute force.
They would torture the local dealers into taxation and compliance. The torture wasn't just to get information, it was part of the business takeover. It made sure that any dealers who survived became terrified, obedient franchises in the cartel's network. No questions asked.
And to cement that control, they developed what you can only call a propaganda of terror. The visual element was critical. It was how they broadcast their power across huge areas. We have these chilling descriptions of the propaganda videos they would circulate.
And these weren't for them. These were public service announcements of their absolute power. They'd show a person sitting down, they'd cut their throat, and then stick a knife through the trachea, and just leave them there, on camera, to slowly drown in their own blood for minutes.
That specific, agonizing method of killing, filmed and distributed, serves no practical purpose. None. It's purely to maximize terror. It guarantees that rivals, locals, even the police, will comply immediately. It sends the message that resistance comes with an unbearable, unthinkable price. It's when violence stops being a tool and becomes a public spectacle of total power.
The kind of institutional violence you need to run an empire on the outside, it's mirrored, and a lot of times it's even magnified inside the prison system. It's this super compressed, high-stress ecosystem, a closed economy where the currency is contraband and debt collection is just pure brutality.
The economics inside the walls, they're just staggering, and they create this immediate need for violent enforcement. The inflation is insane because the demand is constant and the supply is so risky. I mean, we're talking about a single line of meth going for $20, or a prison gram of black tar heroin, which is what the size of peanut M&M.
Yeah.
They'll run you $600.
$600. So this black market with these crazy prices, it demands instant, absolute enforcement. There's no collateral. There's no small claims court. The only way to collect a debt is the threat of being maimed or killed.
And the weapons, the injuries, they reflect this constant low-level war that's just part of daily life on the block. And we really need to be clear about the two main types of violent discipline inside, based on what the sources tell us.
Right. First, you have slashings. These are usually not meant to kill. They're about discipline, humiliation. In places like Rikers, they have a name for it. A $1.50. It comes from the razor cut across the face, a cut so bad it'll take 150 stitches to close.
The $1.50 is symbolic. It's not an execution, it's a message. It leaves a permanent, very visible scar on the victim, a brand. It tells everyone who sees it that this person didn't pay a debt or broke a rule. It's common for gang discipline over smaller things.
Then you contrast that with stabbings. Stabbings are almost always meant to be fatal. They're done with shanks, burners, homemade knives, sometimes 8 inches long, sharpened to a point. And the fights break out over anything: a TV, a drug debt, who gets what spot in the yard, or just a look. Violence isn't the exception, it's the background noise.
And no group exemplifies that absolute, ruthless institutional control like the Mexican Mafia, La M. Their code is absolute. It's a total command structure that goes way beyond a guy's prison sentence.
The story about the inmate with only 10 days left. 10 days. That story is just. It's a profound example of their absolute code. This guy was about to walk out a free man, and he was stabbed 32 times and killed on an order.
And the reason? A guard had he had informed on him that the inmate was writing letters to an underage girl on the outside. That was a violation of the code. The punishment was instant, and it was final.
The crucial detail here, as one source put it, is that there is no consideration for getting out. The fact that he was 10 days away from freedom meant absolutely nothing. The code is the only thing that matters, and enforcing it like that sends a message to every single inmate. You never, ever escape the discipline of Lemme.
You see that same intensity in other groups, too, like the Aryan Brotherhood in the Texas prisons. Big Herc detailed some of this. Accounts of huge fights just erupting in the chow hall, ending in a bloody mass. I mean, these places are pressure cookers, designed for violence to just explode.
But the thing that makes this environment so different is the role of the staff. Their indifference, or sometimes their active encouragement. We hear these reports again and again from Texas, that the guards will literally allow you to fight. Sometimes they'll come onto the pod just to watch, as long as the inmates don't pull the guards into it.
It's the state outsourcing population control. The guards know the inmates have to manage their own hierarchies.
Yeah.
And by allowing this disciplined violence, they're basically letting the gangs maintain a brutal but predictable order. It makes their jobs easier. It's this unspoken deal where the state gives up its monopoly on force inside the walls.
And sometimes that goes from just looking the other way to actually helping. There's that one anecdote from Hazleton. A white correctional officer is shaking an inmate down and finds a hidden knife, a shank. Instead of taking it and writing him up, the CO just tells him, "Take off, man. You need that more than I do."
That one moment, it just captures the entire reality of prison life.
Right.
The officer's acknowledging that in that world, self-defense is not a right, it's a necessity. And by letting the inmate keep the weapon, he's admitting that the inmate's survival code is more legitimate in that moment than the state's official rules. It's a chilling admission of where the real power lies.
The scale of violence we've been talking about, from the street to the prison yard, it's devastating. But it's in the stories of torture, the near-death experiences, that's where you really see the psychological cost. This isn't just about enforcement anymore. This is about completely breaking a person.
And we have to start with the state-sanctioned torture, because that so often sets the standard for brutality. Roger Reeves, the drug pilot, his story of what the Mexican federal police did to him, it was systematic. It was professional torture.
He was stripped naked, tortured with a cattle prod. Then they forced him to inhale this terrible gas that he said felt like it blew my head off. He was locked in this tiny 5 by 5 cement cell, and the whole time he could hear other people being beaten and tortured just outside.
That's a key part of it, right? The psychological terror of knowing you're next.
It is. It's the systematic application of pain and terror to get information or just to demoralize a person until they completely collapse. And you can compare that directly to the cartel's own methods, which are just as brutal, even if they're a little less structured.
Yeah, Jaime Torres, the Sicario, he talked about being captured by a rival cartel during the war between Chapo and the Beltrans. They beat him, and then they used a method called la bolsa, the bag. They tied him up and put a rag or a canvas bag over his head, and then they just poured water over it. For about 20 minutes, he said. It's a localized, terrifying form of waterboarding. It's designed to simulate drowning, to create maximum panic and suffocation, to make you believe over and over that you're about to die. Going through that, whether it's the state or a cartel doing it, it leaves a catastrophic scar on your psyche.
And this constant, intense exposure to death, it leads people to this really dark place, this pathological state where they almost start courting death. It's like a form of control or self-destruction.
The story of the Pickerwood gang member is a perfect illustration of that. He gets into a confrontation, guys start shooting at him, and he doesn't run for cover. He runs straight at the shooter while the guy's emptying the clip. He admitted later that he'd reached a point where he thought everyone, including himself, were better off if he just died. That's not bravery. It's a deep, death-seeking recklessness born from trauma and addiction.
It's so interesting, though, how some people manage to survive psychologically by holding on to some tiny piece of a moral code, even in a totally immoral business. Ali Sadiq, the former crack dealer, he was very aware of the damage crack was doing to his community. He knew it was poison, but he was still selling it.
So his psychological survival strategy was to create and maintain a very strict moral red line for himself. He said he never sold to children, never sold to pregnant women. That small, fiercely protected rule was a defense mechanism. It let him rationalize what he was doing and hold on to some sense of self, some identity in a world of total corruption. It's the human need to draw a line in the sand, even when you're drowning.
But for so many others, especially the ones who stay in these active conflict zones, the sheer amount of death and violence it becomes normal. It leads to this complete emotional numbness.
The Sicario Jaime Torres, he reflected on that, the normalization of muerte y la guerra, death and war. In his area, he said it was just the bread of every day. It stops being shocking. It just becomes another administrative part of the job.
And you see that same numbness, that same response to acute trauma in other war zones. The accounts from the Blackwater mercenary in Iraq are haunting. He described the daily grind, just washing blood out of Humvees with pressure washers, running mission after mission.
And he told that story about watching 4 Marines burned to death inside a tank. His reaction is what's so telling. He said he found himself praying for the fire to get hotter, to finish it faster because there was no saving them. That is an extreme self-preserving coping mechanism. The only thing left to wish for is a quicker end to the suffering because standard human empathy, the instinct to help, has been completely burned away by the trauma.
That level of numbness is what's required to keep functioning. It's not just about seeing horrible things, it's about your internal wiring shutting down so your body can keep moving when your soul can't take it anymore.
So after documenting all the functions and all the costs, we get to the central question, the one we can't avoid. Is all of this overwhelming violence a strategic necessity for success in the criminal world? Or is it actually a failure of business logic, a descent into personal pathology?
Well, the sources, overwhelmingly, they point to a pretty strong link between a willingness to use immediate overwhelming force and the actual scale and success of the criminal enterprise. The top-tier hustles required it.
You can see it in the Detroit drug kingpin story. For him to move up to selling 200 units a week, he had to get involved with guys who were willing to order killings to disrupt the old power structure. That kind of growth, it required a reputation, a known willingness to escalate to fatal levels to protect your supply lines in your market.
And then you go up the chain to the national level. The Hells Angels leaders, guys like Jim Brandis and Chico Mignon, they were consistently described as really ruthless. And these were the guys who controlled a huge piece of the U.S. meth market in the late 80s. The size of their empire was a direct reflection of their capacity for violence.
So from a purely clinical, functional viewpoint, in a world with no laws, violence works. It's a successful strategy. It's the only way to enforce a contract, to hold territory, to secure logistics. The threat of force, Django sitting on that shotgun, that's the prerequisite for making a profit.
But not everyone we've studied agrees with that. There is a counterargument. It usually comes from guys who were focused on the high-end, cleaner side of the hustle. They argue that relying on brutality is actually a failure of sophisticated business sense.
Right, this is the perspective of the Harlem dealer who said he didn't want people to be afraid of him. He wanted to make money based on his reputation, his reliability, the quality of his product. For him, seeing guns come out during a drug deal was a sign of instability, a red flag. He'd never deal with that person again. The risk and the mess that came with violence just wasn't worth it.
Which brings us right back to the decay of the mafia. The consensus among the insiders was clear. Killing over money, like Dominic getting rid of his creditor, was a sign the mob was losing their minds. That's the shift. From strategic violence killing a rival boss to restructure the organization, to pathological violence killing a guy you owe money to for personal convenience. One, in theory, preserves the enterprise. The other just eats it alive from the inside.
So I think what the sources suggest is that while some initial foundational violence like taking territory is a functional necessity,
Yeah.
letting that violence spiral into internal self-serving pathology that guarantees the organization will collapse. It destroys trust. It destroys discipline.
And finally, we have to look at the highest level of strategy. The direct confrontation between the state and these massive criminal organizations. This is where you see cartels that operate with military-grade power, forcing law enforcement to act like an army.
The capabilities of modern cartels, like the CJNG, are just chilling. They represent a complete military evolution. We have that account from the Sicario who described setting up trucks to fire on and take down a Mexican Marine helicopter. A helicopter. This isn't gang-on-gang street fighting anymore. This is narco-military power.
So law enforcement has to meet that force with equal force. Ed Calderon, Sombra, he described his anti-Zeta operations in Coahuila. It was a war machine, military superiority, advanced intelligence. But those kinds of operations, they sometimes mean you have to bend or break the traditional rules of policing.
Exactly. For example, organizing a raid on a meth lab, a Punta de Venta. You might not have time to get a warrant from a judge. The threat is so immediate, so dangerous, that you have to respond with overwhelming force right now. When your opponent is basically a rival army, the line between police work and military action it evaporates.
And it's all part of this constant global arms race. You have to zoom out and see the huge supply chain that fuels all of it. Whether it's the U.S. government shipping 150 million rounds of AK-47 ammo to Afghanistan, or the illegal arms trafficking that funnels weapons back to the cartels, it's one massive global war machine, and the criminals are just one of its many customers.
So through this whole deep dive, we've seen violence quantified over and over. We've seen it used as a currency. $600 for a prison gram of heroin, a $250,000 mob debt erased with a bullet, territorial rights bought by sitting on a shotgun. It's transactional, it's functional, and tragically, it's very effective at achieving its short-term goals.
But the one constant, the line that runs through every single one of these accounts, is the enduring catastrophic human cost. It doesn't matter if the violence is cold and strategic or hot and pathological. The price is always paid by individuals. It shows up as trauma, as numbness, as the slow, steady unraveling of everything that makes a person whole. The individual is always the collateral damage.
And what stands out to me most profoundly is the mirror image you see in so many of these accounts. You have the criminal's cold calculus of disposable life on one side, and on the other, you have this deep institutional indifference to it.
I mean, exactly. The FBI just dropping the investigation into an assassination plot on a judge because it's no longer useful leverage. Prison guards literally watching inmates fight to the death for sport. It suggests that even the systems we create to enforce order can start to see human life as just another tool, another bargaining chip, instead of something with absolute value.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. If the state and its most brutal competitors both end up operating on a calculus where some lives are disposable, then what does justice or order really mean in the face of that kind of absolute power? And what happens to the whole social contract when the very institutions tasked with holding a monopoly on violence start to either outsource it or just ignore it entirely? That's something to think about long after this is over.